Hey everyone, and welcome back to This Explainer. Today we've got a truly fascinating journey ahead of us. We're going to start by looking at something super small but incredibly common. Literally just a single child staring in absolute terror at a normal house cat. But by the end of our time together, we're going to zoom all the way out to the UK National Health Service to see how understanding and treating that one specific fear can unlock millions of pounds in structural healthcare savings. It's like a giant puzzle, and it is absolutely brilliant when it all snaps together. To start us off, we really have to ground ourselves in the reality of the child's experience by asking this fundamental question. Why does a simple cat completely terrify so many kids? Because animal fears are actually the most common specific phobias of childhood. And here's the truly surprising part, the part that kind of blows my mind. Research on where these phobias actually come from finds that in a lot of cases, there was literally no direct frightening experience at all, right? Like a child doesn't necessarily need to be scratched or bitten to develop a phobia. Often the fear arrives simply by watching someone else react with panic, or honestly, just by being told that the animal is dangerous. The idea just spreads like wildfire. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, the fear of cats. So what is it about cats that triggers such a massive, profound psychological response? Well, it all comes down to the unique and highly specific profile of feline unpredictability. You see, cats just do not behave like dogs. A dog can usually be read pretty easily, right? A child can see its tail bogging or, hear it panting heavily. But a cat, totally different profile. They're incredibly fast, they are virtually silent, and they are notoriously unpredictable. Plus, they have this habit of approaching you right at the ankle, seemingly appearing out of thin air. When you take an animal that's already inherently hard to read and you add in sharp claws, maybe a sudden lunge during play, or an unexpected hiss, well, a single event, or even just the anticipation of an event, can be completely enough to spark a deep-seated phobia. And this brilliantly illustrates the whole concept. Think of it this way. Imagine the difference between a car you can hear coming from a block away versus a car that appears completely silently right beside you. The loud car? That gives you time to prepare. The silent car entirely removes your predictability and control. To a kid, a cat is that silent car. The terror stems completely from that terrifying lack of predictability. Section 2. Steps to overcome fear. Let's transition away from the problem for a second and look at the actual psychological solutions for treating these specific phobias. How do you break down the mechanics of exposure therapy in a way that actually works for a child? Well, the evidence gives us 3 incredibly actionable steps. Number 1, distance, not avoidance. Having a calm cat behind a closed door, or even just on the other side of a large room where the child is completely free to leave, that counts as exposure. Fleeing the house entirely? Yeah, that does not. Number 2, give the child control of every single step. They absolutely must be the one to decide when to move closer. Nobody should ever just hand them the cat. And number 3, learn to read the animal. You can teach a child the signals, like watching the tail, the ears, or that super subtle "I'm done" ear flick. By doing this, you're literally converting the terrifying unpredictability of the animal into a forecast the child can actually understand. Which brings us to Section 3, the forced hello. So, the crucial point is we have to talk about a very intuitive, very common, but honestly disastrous mistake that well-meaning adults make when trying to help. It's so tempting for a caregiver to just pick the cat up and bring it directly to the child so they can see, look, it's friendly. But doing this, it completely removes the single most important element that makes exposure therapy work, the child's control. When you remove their agency and force the greeting, you are almost certainly buying a much, much bigger fear than you started with. Seriously, just stop. Let's move on to Section 4, OST versus CBT. Okay, now that we've established the psychological baseline, specifically that we absolutely must respect the child's control and agency, let's look at the clinical solutions. When we actually honor that control, we can utilize a highly condensed treatment approach called one-session treatment, or OST. But before we compare the treatments themselves, we need to dramatically zoom out for a second to grasp the sheer scale of this issue. 93,000. That's the estimated number of children and young people in the UK alone, which is about 0.8% of that demographic, who suffer from specific phobias severe enough to substantially impact their daily lives. Guys, we are dealing with a massive structural health challenge here. So how do healthcare systems even begin to treat this? Currently, the gold standard is multi-session cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. You've probably heard of it. This involves 6 to 12 weekly, 1-hour sessions. And yes, it is highly effective, but it's also incredibly time-consuming,
requires specialist therapists, and comes at a serious cost with really limited availability. By contrast, one-session treatment, or OST, takes that whole process and condenses the entire treatment into just 2 sessions, an initial 1-hour planning and assessment session, followed by a single 3-hour graded exposure session. That's it.
Now, to figure out if this condensed treatment is actually viable, researchers conducted the ASPECT trial, which is basically the scientific backbone of our entire analysis today. This was a rigorous, multi-center, randomized controlled trial involving 267 youth. The whole goal was to test both the clinical and cost effectiveness of OST versus traditional CBT. And wow, the clinical results were astonishing. They proved that a single extended graded exposure session works just about as well as a multi-week CBT program.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 5, the economic big picture.
We are now pivoting from the clinical efficacy of OST to its profound structural impact on healthcare economics. When we look at intervention delivery costs per patient, multi-session CBT averages £287.71. OST comes in significantly lower at £209.60. Because OST drastically reduces the total number of sessions required, it directly drives down the intervention delivery costs. What's absolutely amazing about this is that it achieves this lower cost even when you factor in the high upfront trainer fees required to teach the professionals how to deliver OST in the first place. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this specific number, £302.96. After bootstrapping the data and adjusting for a few various factors, this number represents the average total savings per patient when using OST instead of CBT, and that's specifically from the perspective of the NHS and personal social services, over a 6-month follow-up period. By requiring fewer resources and fewer clinical hours, the savings per patient become pretty undeniable. But obviously, we have to address the elephant in the room. Does a cheaper, faster treatment mean we're somehow sacrificing the child's well-being? Well, the data here is crystal clear. Quality-adjusted life years, or QALIs, are completely maintained. The ASPECT trial found that OST actually yielded a tiny gain of 0.002 QALIs compared to CBT. To put that into perspective, that's equivalent to an extra 0.73 days of perfect health. So the core takeaway you really need to remember here is that cheaper and faster absolutely does not mean less effective. The child's health improvement is entirely preserved. And here is where the massive systemic payoff finally drops. When you take that per-patient saving we just talked about and you apply it to the population level, the numbers are just staggering. We know there are roughly 93,000 kids with specific phobias in the UK. The researchers note that if just 50 to 60% of those kids utilize one-session treatment instead of traditional CBT, the National Health Service could save somewhere between 14 and 17 million pounds. I mean, no way, right? That is a real game changer for a healthcare system. Which brings us to our final, somewhat provocative thought. Saving millions in national healthcare starts by asking one simple, very personal question. Will you let the child decide when to say hello? It just loops perfectly back together, doesn't it? The macrosystemic data, literally millions of pounds in healthcare savings, is entirely dependent on following the micropsychological advice. The efficacy of one-session treatment relies completely on distance, reading the animal, and above all, giving the child total control and agency over their exposure. So the next time you see a terrified child faced with a cat, remember, stepping back and letting that kid take control might just be the exact same mechanism that can save a healthcare system millions. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope it changes the way you look at the economics of fear. Catch you next time.